Hello everyone. There seems to be a never-ending supply of generic cameras on Amazon, and every once in a while, one catches my attention and I decide to check it out. This camera is advertised as a vlogging and YouTube camera. It has a fair number of reviews on Amazon, so it seems to be getting other people's attention too. This camera is normally $159, but there is currently a coupon that takes it down to $119. It is advertised as having 4K, and it says so right on the camera. And it's advertised as having 48 megapixel photos. Both of those claims are simply not true, regardless of the fact that the 4K video looks like something well below 1080p. The files aren't even 3840 by 2160. They are 2880 by 2160, which is what a lot of these cheap, supposedly 4K cameras provide. And believe me, it looks nowhere near as detailed as even 1080p from a good camera. And the supposedly 48 megapixel photos are probably more like 5 to 10 megapixels at most. It also claims 16x powerful zoom, but it has nowhere near that. It also claims to have digital image stabilization, but like all of these cheap cameras and camcorders I've tested, that setting does nothing. It also claims to have face detection, and it does sometimes put a box around faces, but it is extremely inconsistent, and most importantly, there is 0 point to face detection on this camera because there is no autofocus, and it doesn't affect exposure either. So it is an absolutely meaningless feature in this camera. They just throw it in so it seems like it has the features that a real camera does, but it's totally pointless. And that's one of the biggest problems I have with this camera. So much about it is just for show to make it seem more impressive than it is. And not only do many of these things do nothing to actually improve the experience using it, some of them actually are a detriment to the quality and usability. This camera is heavier than I would expect even without the wide-angle lens, and I suspect there's some random metal inside to make it heavier, as I've found that on a lot of other of these cheap cameras. But the wide-angle lens is also very large and heavy, and with this add-on lens, the total complete package is surprisingly heavy, and it's very front-heavy and awkward, combined with being made entirely out of slippery, hard plastic, and this camera is actually pretty easy to drop. This camera is very nearly as large and heavy as my Olympus EM1 Mark III, and it's all for no reason. This camera doesn't even remotely compete in terms of functionality and image quality with this tiny Canon point-and-shoot camera. On cameras with large sensors, lenses have to be a certain size in order to achieve a given focal length and aperture, as well as being large enough to house things like focus systems, adjustable aperture systems, etc. This lens has none of that, and the sensor in this camera is tiny. To illustrate my point, here are a couple of accessory lenses for cell phone cameras. They are tiny and extremely lightweight. And if I hold one of these lenses up to the lens of this camera, you can see it works just fine. This is the macro lens, and you can see it's focusing on my fingers, and it covers the whole lens, no problem. Even the super wide-angle lens works fine, just held up to the lens of this camera. So there is no need for that giant lens. The tiny built-in lens on this Canon has a wider field of view than this giant lens provides to this camera, and it also has powered 10 times optical zoom, autofocus, and closer macro focusing than this lens does when you separate it for macro mode. I know it sounds like I'm harping on this one thing, but the point is, the wide-angle lens offers far less functionality than the tiny built-in lens on the Canon, while being pointlessly large and heavy. It's all for show. The camera does have a touchscreen, but you have to click most options twice. Once to select it, and again to make something actually happen. Or three times if it doesn't accept it the first time. When in photo or video mode, pushing the erase button will jump to a screen asking you if you want to delete what I assume is the last photo taken. And that's fine, but when actually in playback mode, just looking at pictures or videos, you have to dig through the menu to delete things because this erase button doesn't do anything in the playback mode. It also shares the problem that many of these cameras have in that sharpness, white balance, and color are all available only in photo mode. So they actually only show up in the menu for photo mode, but they do affect photo and video mode. So if you're in video mode and you want to make one of those changes, you actually have to switch to photo mode, make the change, then switch back to video mode. It also has weird glitches like a often very delayed response to zooming in the controls. And also, if you take a picture with the camera zoomed in all the way, the display goes purple. So that's an interesting quirk. Also, if you are in playback mode and you are zoomed in at all, or you are in a position like this where you're looking at multiple pictures and videos, you cannot then switch to the other modes. So I cannot switch to playback, or I cannot switch from playback to camera or video modes because I'm viewing multiple pictures at once. If I scroll in and zoom in on a picture, once again, I cannot switch to camera or video mode. I have to be looking at only one picture and not be zoomed in at all, then I can switch modes. Most cameras will allow you to switch quickly so you don't miss a shot, and most cameras only require a press of the shutter button to switch right out of playback mode into video or photo mode. On this camera, it's kind of a pain. It has multiple white balance modes, but really it only has two, and neither of them are very accurate regardless of the lighting situation. Auto, tungsten, and fluorescent all look the same. They all have a strong magenta shift while being a little bit cool overall. The other modes are all way too orange. Typical of these generic cameras, this one has a lot of digital sharpening in the photos and videos. I imagine this is to give the illusion of detail, but it makes things look artificial and strange at times, and there are noticeable sharpening artifacts if you crop in at all, and sometimes even if you don't. You can turn sharpening down, but unfortunately it's still noticeable even on low, and it defaults back to normal every time you turn the camera off and back on. This camera can work as a webcam, but so can a cheap webcam. So it would be less expensive and probably have as good or better quality to just get a small, cheap webcam. This camera also has Wi-Fi, but it only allows you to connect to a mobile device that has the app on it, and it's a generic app that has poor reviews and poor functionality. If you're just looking for a cheap, basic camera, something like this Canon point and shoot would serve you far better. It's currently $169, which is only $10 more than the regular price of this generic camera. But it has auto and program modes with lots of adjustability, including a night mode and a long shutter mode. It also has optical image stabilization, 720p video that manages to look better than the supposed 4K from this generic camera. It has better color, 10x optical zoom that manages to zoom in much farther than the supposed 16x of this generic camera, slightly closer focusing macro without having to swap lenses, wider maximum viewing angle without having to swap lenses, autofocus, much better detail in photos, and more. Granted, this is still a cheap point and shoot, so the quality isn't amazing, and it is a bit more expensive, particularly when you factor in the current coupon with the generic camera. But it is such a far more capable camera, and it's much nicer to use. And it's just one example of what's out there these days. Plus, most people have a camera on their phone. And if you just want something to take halfway decent snapshots or short videos, and you have a smartphone from the last 10 years, that camera is better than this generic camera. But either way, I recommend against these generic cameras regardless. They're poor quality, they have poor functionality, they make false claims in the ads, they're designed to look like far more than what they actually are, even at a cost to actual convenience and usability. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care.